Under the golden light of early summer, the Rain Valley Vineyard stretched for acres across the rolling hills of Northern California, each row of vines heavy with the promise of another good year. To anyone passing by, it looked like a scene from a postcard. Sunlight shimmering off the leaves, a faint breeze carrying the scent of oak and soil, and at the center of it all, a man whose entire life was tied to this land. Lucas Rain, 42, stood at the edge of the field with a clipboard in one hand and a pruning knife in the other, surveying what 3 generations of his family had built. His father, and his father before him, had turned this dry, stubborn stretch of ground into something living, something worth saving. For Lucas, this place wasn't just property. It was memory, identity, and inheritance wrapped in vines and dust. He still remembered being a boy, running between the rows while his father's laughter echoed through the valley. The old farmhouse, its white paint faded by decades of sun, still smelled faintly of the oak barrels where they had aged their first wine. When his father died 5 years ago, Lucas took over without hesitation. He wasn't just keeping the business alive, he was keeping a promise whispered over a hospital bed. "Don't let them take it from us." Those words had haunted him ever since, though at the time he hadn't understood what his father meant. Now, as he watched the sun dip lower behind the western ridge, he finally did. The trouble began when the Homeowners Association expanded its reach. Originally created to manage a few newer homes built on the outskirts of the valley, the HOA had grown bolder each year, annexing parcels of rural land under the guise of community standards. Lucas had ignored their letters at first. Annoying. Pamphlets slipped into his mailbox, citing rules about fencing heights, drainage, and unauthorized commercial use. He didn't consider himself part of their neighborhood. His family had owned this vineyard long before the HOA existed, long before most of the residents even knew the valley's name. But bureaucracy had a way of creeping in like ivy, unnoticed until it strangled the roots. The first formal notice arrived in a plain envelope, printed on expensive paper with embossed lettering, "Notice of Violation. Agricultural activity in a residential zone." The phrasing made Lucas laugh bitterly. Agricultural activity. That was what they called 30 years of family labor, of pruning in the rain and harvesting under the blistering sun. He had assumed it was a clerical mistake, some administrative oversight, but when he called the HOA office, a cold voice on the other end told him otherwise. "Mr. Rain," the woman said, "vineyards are not permitted under Section 4B of community zoning ordinances. You'll need to cease all production activities within 30 days. He had hung up before she could finish. The vineyard wasn't just a business, it was his blood. He wasn't about to let a handful of suburban bureaucrats rewrite history because they wanted a uniform view from their backyards. For weeks he tried to ignore the pressure, burying himself in the work. But the letters kept coming. Then came the fines, the threats of legal action, and finally the visit from Meredith Lawson, the HOA president. She arrived unannounced one morning in a spotless white SUV, her sunglasses reflecting the fields like mirrors. Her tone was polite, but her words were edged with power. "Mr. Rain," she said, "you're a reasonable man. I'm sure you understand that communities need structure. What you're doing here doesn't fit our long-term development plan." Lucas had stared at her for a long moment before answering. "My family planted these vines before your community even existed," he said evenly. "You don't get to decide what happens on this land." Meredith smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that carried no warmth. "That's what everyone says," she replied softly, "until they realize the rules apply to them too." She left a business card on the porch table, the embossed HOA logo glinting in the sun. For the rest of the day, Lucas worked in silence, her words echoing in his mind. The valley felt different now, as if something cold had settled beneath the soil. The vines swayed gently in the breeze, but the peace he had always felt here was gone. At sunset, he walked the length of the property, tracing the fence line where the boundary met the newly built homes of the HOA members. They had manicured lawns and neat driveways, the kind of perfection that demanded control. He wondered if they saw his vineyard as an eyesore, an inconvenience standing in the way of their tidy vision of progress. When night finally fell, Lucas lingered by the old oak tree at the heart of the vineyard. He ran his hand along its rough bark, remembering how his father used to rest there after long days of harvest. The stars were bright, the air heavy with the scent of ripening grapes, and for a fleeting moment he felt the same peace he'd always known here. Yet beneath it pulsed something darker, a quiet certainty that the fight for this land was only beginning. He didn't know how far the HOA would go, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to defend Rain Valley, whatever it took. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a Sunday morning, just after sunrise, when the valley was still soaked in mist and the air tasted faintly of dew. Lucas had been walking the vineyard as he did every morning, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, when he noticed that one of the lower rows looked pale and drooping. From a distance he thought it might have been the fog distorting his view, or perhaps a patch of mildew from the recent rains. But as he drew closer, his stomach tightened. The leaves weren't merely dull, they were dying, yellowed, curling inward, the stems brittle to the touch. The vines looked as though they had been scorched from within. He knelt down, brushing his fingers against the ground, and felt the unmistakable scent of chemicals rising from the damp soil. The earth reeked of something sharp, synthetic, foreign. By mid-morning, the damage was impossible to ignore. Entire sections of the lower vineyard had begun to wither, the fruit shriveling as if burned by invisible fire. Lucas called his foreman, Matteo, who had worked alongside his family for over 20 years. The two of them examined the rows in silence, their faces grim. Matteo finally broke the quiet. "This isn't drought," he said quietly. "This is poison." Lucas wanted to argue, to find some other explanation, but the evidence was right there. The color of the leaves, the texture of the soil, it wasn't natural. Someone had sprayed or poured something across the vines deliberately. They collected samples of the dirt and leaves, sealing them into plastic bags. Lucas drove straight to the agricultural lab in town, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. The technician promised results within 48 hours. 2 days later, the report arrived, and with it came the confirmation he had dreaded. The soil contained high levels of a banned industrial herbicide, atrazine. It was potent enough to destroy plant tissue within hours of exposure, a chemical that had no reason to exist anywhere near a vineyard. The report might as well have been a death sentence. Lucas called the county sheriff, who sent a deputy to take a statement. The young officer listened, polite but detached, jotting notes on a pad as Lucas tried to explain what had happened. When Lucas mentioned the HOA disputes, the deputy's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You think they did this?" he asked, not mocking, just cautious. "They've been threatening fines," Lucas said. "They sent letters saying I had 30 days to stop all operations. Now half my crop is dead. You tell me if that's a coincidence." The deputy promised to file a report and contact the environmental division, but his tone carried no urgency. When he left, Lucas had the sinking feeling that nothing would come of it. That same afternoon, a white SUV pulled up near the vineyard gate. He recognized it immediately, the HOA president's vehicle. Meredith Lawson stepped out, immaculate as ever, wearing a beige suit and large sunglasses that caught the sunlight like mirrors. She didn't approach the vines, only stood by the fence, surveying the damage as if inspecting a problem that had already been solved. "I heard about your incident," she said, her voice smooth, almost sympathetic. "It's a shame, truly. But perhaps this is a sign, Mr. Rain. The land might be trying to tell you something. Maybe it's time to let it rest." Lucas stared at her, disbelief giving way to anger. "You think this is some kind of divine message?" he asked sharply. "Someone poured poison into my soil, And you're talking about signs?" Meredith's smile didn't falter. "No one in our association would do something like that," she said evenly. "We only authorized a small-scale weed treatment along the border fence. It was necessary to control invasive growth before it spread to community land." She paused, her tone softening in feigned concern. "Perhaps some overspray occurred. These things happen." Lucas took a step closer, his voice low but trembling with fury. "You came onto my property and sprayed herbicide without permission?" Meredith adjusted her sunglasses, unbothered. "Technically, the border area falls under shared maintenance according to the new zoning adjustments. I trust you've received the updated map?" He hadn't, and even if he had, it wouldn't have mattered. There was no shared maintenance. This was his land, his vines, his livelihood. But Meredith spoke with the kind of calm arrogance that only people with power could afford. She looked around once more before returning to her car. "I do hope you get this sorted out soon," she said, her voice light as the wind. "It would be unfortunate if the contamination spread further. That might require a full environmental quarantine." The car pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. Lucas stood there long after she was gone, watching the dying vines sway gently in the breeze. Her words echoed in his head. Environmental quarantine. It was a threat disguised as concern. If the county declared his land contaminated, they could lock it down for years. No planting, no harvesting, no business. It would ruin him. That night, Lucas sat alone at the kitchen table, the lab report spread out before him. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every number on the page seemed to accuse him of failing his father's legacy. He poured himself a glass of wine from last year's batch, the last good harvest, and stared out the window toward the fields. The moonlight turned the dying vines into ghostly silhouettes, pale against the darkness. He could almost hear his father's voice in the back of his mind. "Don't let them take it from us." He made a list of every letter, every notice, every encounter with the HOA over the past year. Each piece of paper felt like another nail in a coffin they had been quietly building around him. It wasn't about zoning or community appearance. It was about control, about removing him so they could sell the land to developers. The Vineyard sat on prime ground, surrounded now by half-finished luxury homes and empty lots waiting for expansion. To them, he was an obstacle, a relic in the way of profit. The next morning, Lucas returned to the Vineyard with a renewed sense of purpose. He took photographs of every damaged vine, marked each contaminated section, and sent copies to both the sheriff's office and the Department of Agriculture. He also called a lawyer, someone who had helped his father years ago with a land dispute. Her name was Iva Martin. Sharp, relentless, and known for fighting developers who thought they could buy silence. When Lucas explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. "If they stepped onto your property without consent and caused chemical damage, that's criminal trespass and property destruction," she said. "But we'll need proof. Records, witnesses, everything." By the end of the week, the cost of the destruction became clear. Nearly half the vineyard, 15 acres, was unsalvageable. The loss in potential wine sales alone was over $800,000. Years of work, generations of legacy, reduced to scorched earth and dying roots. The insurance company refused to pay, citing third-party negligence, and hinted that ongoing legal disputes could void his coverage entirely. It was a perfect trap. Ruin him financially, then bury him in red tape. As Lucas stood by the edge of the ruined rose that evening, the scent of chemical rot still lingering in the air, a storm gathered over the hills. The sky darkened to the color of bruised steel, and thunder rolled in the distance. He watched the wind ripple through the few healthy vines that remained and made himself a promise. They wanted him broken, silent, willing to sell. But he wasn't his father's son for nothing. The Rain Valley had survived drought, fire, and years of neglect. It would survive this, too. He clenched his fists and looked toward the homes glittering on the ridge above. "You picked the wrong man to poison," he whispered. The first lawsuit arrived less than 2 weeks after the poison incident, printed on thick cream paper, sealed with the HOA's emblem like a royal decree. It wasn't an apology or even an acknowledgement of what had happened. It was a formal demand that Lucas cease all agricultural and commercial activities within the boundaries of the Rain Valley property. The language was bureaucratic, sterile, and yet every line carried the unmistakable tone of menace. According to the document, Lucas was in violation of zoning code amendments that had supposedly gone into effect 6 months earlier, amendments he had never been notified about. If he failed to comply within 30 days, the HOA reserved the right to pursue fines, injunctions, and property reassignment under community development protocols. It took him 3 readings to process the words property reassignment. They weren't just trying to fine him anymore. They were laying the groundwork to take the land. He drove straight to his lawyer's office in town, a converted farmhouse where Iva Martin ran her small but feared legal practice. The moment she read the document, her eyebrows arched. "They're bluffing," she said, flipping through the pages. "There's no lawful mechanism for property reassignment. They made that up to scare you." Lucas leaned forward across the desk. "They already poisoned my vineyard, Iva." "Does that sound like people who bluff?" She paused at that, the humor fading from her face. "All right," she said quietly. "Then we fight." She began drafting an injunction to block any further enforcement while she investigated the supposed zoning changes. Within hours, her assistant uncovered something deeply suspicious, an updated land use map that had been filed with the county clerk only 8 days before the poisoning, signed by none other than Meredith Lawson. The new document expanded the HOA's jurisdiction lines by several hundred yards, conveniently encompassing the lower section of Lucas's vineyard. When Iva called the county office to verify its legitimacy, the clerk hesitated before confirming that the map had been amended upon request by the HOA's legal counsel. No public hearing, no owner notification, no approval from the zoning commission. It was an administrative ghost entry, slipped quietly into the records. "They forged a boundary," Iva muttered, disbelief turning into anger. "They literally redrew the map to claim your soil." Lucas could feel the walls closing in. He had spent every waking moment trying to save what was left of the vines, hiring soil specialists and irrigation experts to flush out the chemicals, but the damage was irreversible. The poison had sunk too deep, leaching into the groundwater. The remaining plants began to show symptoms one by one, as if the land itself were bleeding. He had already lost $500,000 in projected revenue, and the banks were starting to call. His insurance company had suspended his policy, citing uncertainty of ownership. When he called to protest, the representative spoke with the hollow tone of someone reading from a script. "We understand your frustration, Mr. Rain, but until the property's zoning classification is resolved, we can't authorize any claims." The HOA's attack was methodical. Within a month, he received notices from the county fire department, the Water Management Board, and the Environmental Inspection Division, all citing alleged code violations or permit discrepancies. Each agency demanded documentation he had already submitted years ago, but none of them seemed to acknowledge that fact. It became clear that the HOA was pulling strings, using their political connections to choke him with bureaucracy. Neighbors who used to greet him at the market now avoided eye contact, and one even crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. Rumors had begun circulating that Lucas's vineyard had been polluting the groundwater, that his use of chemicals was unsafe for nearby residents. Someone had fed the local paper a story framing him as a reckless landowner whose outdated agricultural practices threatened community safety. Lucas stopped reading the news altogether. The smear campaign had achieved its goal: public doubt. His reputation, once built on craftsmanship and integrity, was being dismantled one rumor at a time. He spent his nights poring over documents, digging through old county records for proof that his land had always been agricultural. One night, deep in the archives, he found what he was looking for: the original deed, signed in 1978 by his grandfather, which explicitly listed the land as rural agricultural use, grandfathered indefinitely. That single phrase was his shield. He made copies, handed them to Iva, and together they prepared to confront the HOA directly. When they arrived at the HOA headquarters, a sterile, glass-fronted building nestled among new suburban developments, the staff treated them like trespassers. Meredith wasn't in, they said. No, they couldn't schedule a meeting. Yes, all communications had to go through council. Lucas refused to leave. He sat in the lobby for nearly an hour until Meredith finally appeared, descending the staircase like a queen arriving at court. "Mr. Rain," she said coolly, "this isn't a good time." Iva stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "It's the perfect time, actually. We're here to notify you that your recent zoning amendments are fraudulent and have been reported to the county. You've unlawfully encroached on my client's property, and you'll be facing litigation for damages." Meredith blinked, her composure flickering for a fraction of a second before she smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "You're welcome to sue, Miss Martin," she said softly. "But while you're busy with that, the community board will be voting to suspend Mr. Rain's property privileges. We'll see how long he can operate without access to shared utilities." The meaning hit Lucas like a punch. The HOA controlled the local infrastructure, the water lines, the maintenance roads, even the waste systems that connected his property to the valley. If they cut him off, he couldn't irrigate, couldn't process grapes, couldn't function. They didn't need to take his land by force. They could starve it. He stormed out before he said something he couldn't take back. That night, a thunderstorm broke over the valley. The rain pounded against the roof of the farmhouse as Lucas sat in the darkened kitchen, listening to the steady rhythm of water against glass. Power flickered once, then went out completely. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, sloshing through mud to check the breakers near the shed. When he reached the panel, he froze. The main irrigation valve had been shut off, the padlock missing. Beside Rain Creek Homeowners Association. For a long moment, Lucas just stood there in the rain, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The vines stretched before him, dark and silent, the water running off their leaves like tears. This wasn't about fines or rules anymore. It was war. The HOA wanted him gone, and they were willing to destroy everything he loved to make it happen. He turned back toward the house, soaked to the bone, and muttered under his breath, "If they think they can choke me out, they don't know who they're dealing with." The vineyard had always been his family's lifeblood, and now it was his battlefield. The morning the truth began to surface was quiet, deceptively calm, with a thin veil of fog draped across the valley like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Lucas hadn't slept in 2 days, his mind looping through every possible scenario that might explain how the HOA could get away with what they were doing. He sat at the worn oak table in his kitchen, surrounded by piles of papers, legal notices, and photographs of the dying vines. The once vibrant land outside his window now looked like a graveyard, gray, brittle, stripped of the life that had defined it for decades. Eva had promised him she would dig deeper, and when she called that morning, her tone carried the kind of restrained excitement that only came from uncovering something dangerous. "Lucas," she said, "I think we found the connection. You'd better come in." When he arrived at her office, Iva was already pacing, a stack of printed emails in her hands. "I pulled every public record the HOA filed with the county over the past 6 months, she said, handing him a folder. "Then I matched them against contractor permits issued during the same period. Take a look at this." Lucas flipped through the documents and his eyes narrowed. Several of the chemical treatment permits listed an environmental maintenance firm called Green Front Solutions. The name meant nothing to him until Iva revealed the next page, a corporate registry printout showing that Greenfront was owned by a shell company, Lawson Properties, LLC, Meredith's last name. She's their primary shareholder, Iva continued. She signed the invoices for chemical treatment and billed them as community beautification expenses. The dates align exactly with the week your vineyard was poisoned. Lucas stared at the paper, a cold fury spreading through him. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was proof. Meredith had ordered the chemical spraying herself and disguised it under HOA maintenance funds. The same organization that claimed to protect the community had financed the destruction of his livelihood. Eva pointed to another email thread, her voice hardening. It gets worse. Look at this exchange between Meredith and the contractor. She tells them explicitly to ensure that the rain property is neutralized to prevent further agricultural spread. Those are her words, Lucas. Neutralized. She didn't even try to hide it. He felt something in his chest twist sharply, the kind of pain that went beyond anger. He had suspected it all along, but seeing it confirmed in black and white was like watching his father's grave being desecrated. Eva's expression softened as she continued. We can use this. It's enough to file for a criminal investigation, environmental sabotage, property destruction, fraud. But we'll need to move fast before she buries the evidence. Lucas nodded, his jaw set. Then we don't give her the chance. They spent the next few hours assembling a case. Iva's office became a war room, its walls covered in maps, legal timelines, and copies of HOA filings. Every document told a story of manipulation. Amended maps, reallocated budgets, falsified signatures. The web of corruption was wider than either of them had expected. It wasn't just Meredith. Several HOA board members had signed off on the expenses, and one of them, a man named Andrew Cole, had close ties to a real estate developer that had been quietly buying up properties in the valley. The pattern was unmistakable. Destroy or devalue the land, force the owners out, and sell the lots to investors for redevelopment. Lucas's vineyard had simply been the largest and most visible obstacle. That evening, they drove to meet a county environmental investigator named Sandra Hill, who agreed to review their evidence confidentially. She was a pragmatic woman with tired eyes, someone who had clearly seen too many cases buried under politics. After examining the lab reports and financial trails, she exhaled slowly. If what you're showing me checks out, this isn't just a zoning issue, she said. This is deliberate contamination of agricultural land. That's a federal offense. But you need to be prepared for what comes next. Once they realize you have this, they'll come after you harder than before. Lucas met her gaze, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. They already took everything from me. There's nothing left for them to take. Sandra nodded and promised to begin a preliminary inquiry, but she warned that the HOA would likely find out. Bureaucracies had leaks, and Meredith Lawson had friends in places that mattered. The next day, the retaliation began exactly as predicted. When Lucas returned home from town, he found a new notice nailed to his front gate. Cease and desist order. Unauthorized legal action against HOA entities in violation of community contract. It was absurd, almost laughable, but the message beneath, it was clear. They knew he was fighting back, and they wanted him to stop. Later that night, he received an anonymous call from a blocked number. The voice was low, distorted, almost mechanical. You're making a mistake, Mr. Rain, it said. You should walk away before this gets worse. Then the line went dead. Lucas stared at the phone for a long time, the silence around him thick and suffocating. He thought about calling Iva, but decided against it. He didn't want her dragged further into danger. Instead, he grabbed his flashlight and went outside to check the perimeter. The night air was still, too still, and as he walked the fence line he noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the access road near the southern slope. When he followed them, his beam caught the glint of something small and metallic in the dirt. A discarded spray nozzle, the same type used in commercial chemical rigs. It was another piece of evidence, but also a reminder of how easily they could reach him, even in the dead of night. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the valley grew tense. Neighbors whispered. Trucks appeared late at night near the new construction sites, and one morning Lucas found his mailbox torn from its post, the letters scattered across the ground. It was intimidation, pure and simple. Yet, amid the chaos, a small breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mateo, his longtime foreman, arrived one morning looking nervous, clutching an envelope. "You should see this," he said quietly. Inside was a printed memo from the HOA's internal board communications, which one of Mateo's relatives, an employee at the county maintenance department, had slipped to him anonymously. The memo referenced Phase 2 acquisition of rain property and listed projected valuation increases post-purchase. Lucas scanned the figures, feeling the familiar surge of disbelief turning into grim understanding. They had already planned his replacement, even assigning a tentative sale date to a developer named Westmark Properties. His vineyard wasn't just under attack. It had already been sold, on paper at least. That night, Lucas and Iva met again in her office to prepare the final submission for the district court. As they reviewed the documents one last time, Lucas caught a glimpse of himself reflected in the window. Tired, older, but harder too, the kind of man who no longer ran from confrontation. Eva noticed the change as well. "They've underestimated you," she said softly. "They think you're just another landowner who'll fold under pressure. But you're not." Lucas gave a faint, humorless smile. "No," he said. "I'm not." The following morning, they filed the case with both the county court and the state environmental bureau. The complaint included the contractor invoices, the forged zoning maps, the internal emails, and the memo detailing the planned acquisition. It was more than enough to trigger a full investigation. Within hours, news of the filing spread through the valley. Reporters began calling, asking for statements. Meredith's office issued a bland press release denying all allegations and accusing Lucas of spreading misinformation to deflect attention from his numerous code violations. It was the same hollow arrogance he had come to expect. But this time, it didn't scare him. It only confirmed that they were afraid. That evening, Lucas stood on the edge of the vineyard, the sunset bleeding red across the hills. The surviving vines rustled faintly in the wind, fragile but alive, stubbornly clinging to the earth. He thought of his father again, of the promise he had made, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. The battle was far from over, but now he had proof, allies, and a cause larger than himself. Meredith Lawson and her board had treated him like a weed to be uprooted, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had awakened the man who had built his life from stubborn, unyielding soil. And in Rain Valley, nothing that took root so deeply ever died quietly. The day the hearing was announced, the valley seemed to hold its breath. A state investigator had officially opened an inquiry into the HOA's actions, and for the first time, Meredith Lawson's carefully constructed empire began to show cracks. Yet, as the walls of legality started closing in on her, she didn't retreat. She retaliated. Within 48 hours of the investigation becoming public, Lucas's property was swarmed by inspectors, each armed with clipboards and hollow authority. They came in pairs, flashing badges from departments he'd never heard of, claiming to verify structural compliance and soil safety. They combed through his storage barns, took photographs of his equipment, even measured the height of his fencing. When Lucas demanded to know what jurisdiction they had, One of them coolly replied that the visits were routine for properties under investigation. It was clear what was happening. Meredith was using the system as a weapon, twisting bureaucracy into a noose. By the third week, the harassment had become a daily ritual. He would wake to find new violation notices taped to his gate. Warnings about unauthorized signage, overgrown vegetation, and even offensive odor emissions. Each one came with an attached fine, absurd in its precision, and an implication that more would follow if he continued to obstruct community progress. The psychological warfare was exhausting. Even his deliveries began disappearing. A shipment of irrigation parts vanished somewhere between the supplier and his property. Another, containing grape preservative chemicals, was accidentally redirected to an address 2 towns over. When Lucas contacted the courier, they offered polite apologies but no solutions. It was as if an invisible hand was quietly cutting off every lifeline he had. One night, just before dawn, the real message arrived. Lucas woke to the sound of crackling outside. Sharp, stuttering pops like dry branches catching fire. He ran to the porch and froze. One of his storage sheds, the one where he kept the remaining barrels of last year's wine, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared high, painting the vines in orange light as the night bled away into chaos. He grabbed the nearest hose, but the pressure was dead. His water line had been shut off again. By the time the fire department arrived, half the structure was gone, and the air reeked of burned oak and chemicals. The captain's expression was sympathetic but cautious when Lucas explained his suspicions. "You're saying someone did this on purpose?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. Lucas handed him a copy of the latest cease and desist order from the HOA. "I'm saying they've been trying to erase me for months," he replied. An hour later, as the last embers cooled, he found something half buried near the remains of the shed, a fragment of a plastic container, its label melted but still legible enough to read the words, "Green Front Solutions." The same company Meredith had used to poison his vines. He took photos, stored the fragment in a bag, and called Iva. Her voice was quiet but steady. "They're escalating because they're scared," she said. "We need to move faster before they spin this as an accident." She was right. That same afternoon, a reporter from the Sonoma Tribune called to ask about the recent fire caused by improper storage of chemicals. Meredith's narrative had already reached the press. The store Eva filed an emergency injunction requesting protective oversight from the State Environmental Bureau, arguing that Lucas's safety was at risk. Meanwhile, she and Sandra Hill gathered more evidence linking Greenfront to Meredith's financial accounts. They discovered multiple payments made under false invoice codes, each labeled as pest control maintenance, all approved personally by her. One particularly damning email from Meredith to Andrew Cole read, "Once rain is out, we can proceed with the land transfer. Keep the pressure consistent until he folds." It was enough to turn the investigation from administrative to criminal. Still, the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. Lucas started noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked along the ridge, their windows tinted, engines idling for hours before disappearing at dusk. His sleep came rarely, and when it did, it was haunted by the sound of his father's voice, soft, weary, asking why he hadn't left when he had the chance. The vineyard had always been his refuge, but now it felt like a battlefield under siege. Matteo, loyal as ever, urged him to leave, to take time away until the court intervened. Lucas refused. "If I walk away now," he said, staring out over the ruined rows, "they win, and they'll do this to someone else next." His stubbornness frightened Matteo, but it also inspired him. The next day, several neighbors quietly appeared at the gate, farmers, old friends of his father, offering to help. They didn't say much, but their presence meant more than words. Together they rebuilt the damaged fencing, restored part of the irrigation line, and began documenting everything that happened. The community Meredith had tried to manipulate was beginning to turn against her. 2 nights later, Lucas received an email from an anonymous address. It contained a single attachment, a scanned page of HOA board meeting minutes, heavily redacted but with one section intact. It detailed a planned coordination with external parties for expedited acquisition, followed by an address, his. The sender had signed only with the initials AC, Andrew Cole. It seemed that Meredith's second-in-command had decided to switch sides. Lucas forwarded it to Iva, and she immediately called him back. "If Cole's talking, it means Meredith's losing control," she said. "This could be our leverage. We'll subpoena him." But Meredith struck first. The next morning, Lucas awoke to find uniformed officers at his door with a warrant. They claimed to be investigating illegal chemical disposal on his property, an accusation fabricated entirely from the false story she'd fed the media. They searched his sheds, turned over barrels, and photographed his equipment while Meredith herself stood at the gate, her arms crossed, watching like a queen surveying conquered land. When their eyes met, she smiled faintly. "You should have taken my advice, Mr. Rain," she said. "All this could have been avoided." It took every ounce of restraint not to confront her. Eva arrived just as the officers were finishing and presented them with court documents proving the investigation into HOA misconduct was still active. The officers, caught between conflicting jurisdictions, withdrew, but the damage was done. News vans appeared within hours, and by sunset the story was everywhere. Vineyard owner under environmental investigation. That night, Lucas walked the perimeter of his property under a sky heavy with clouds. The land was quiet except for the hum of crickets and the distant echo of traffic from the highway. He stopped near the charred remains of the shed and knelt, running his fingers through the ash. Beneath the soot, he could still smell the faint sweetness of the lost wine, mixed now with smoke and bitterness. "They can burn the vines," he murmured, "but they can't kill what's buried here." In the distance, the lights from the HOA's luxury homes glittered like the eyes of predators, cold and unblinking. When he returned to the house, he found an email from Iva waiting in his inbox. The subject line read simply, "We've got her." Attached were certified bank statements showing wire transfers from Greenfront Solutions to Meredith's private account, amounts totaling over $200,000. It was irrefutable proof of personal profit from the destruction of his vineyard. As Lucas stared at the figures, a long, slow exhale escaped his chest. For the first time in months, the tide had shifted. Meredith had drawn blood, but now he finally had the weapon to strike back. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, the air dense with the low hum of whispered speculation and the faint rustle of papers. The case of Rain versus Rain Creek Homeowners Association had drawn reporters, environmental activists, and local residents who had followed every development of the scandal that had shaken their quiet valley. The fluorescent lights reflected off the polished wooden tables, casting long, sterile shadows that made everything feel both sharp and unreal. Lucas sat beside Eva at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw tense. Across the room, Meredith Lawson occupied the opposite side with her team of attorneys. 6 of them, all immaculate in dark suits, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and faint unease. Meredith herself looked composed, but the faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted her papers betrayed her calm facade. The judge, an older man with a measured gaze, called the court to order. The opening statements were brief, procedural, and carried the sterile precision of law. But once Iva began her presentation, the tone shifted. She started not with legal jargon, but with the story of the vineyard, the history of Rain Valley, 3 generations of work, and the family's contribution to the region's identity. The courtroom listened in silence as she described the morning Lucas discovered the dying vines, the lab report confirming the presence of banned chemicals, and the financial ruin that followed. Her voice was steady, her delivery restrained yet heavy with emotion. Then she turned, gesturing toward the evidence table. "What happened to Mr. Rain was not an accident," she said. It was an orchestrated act of destruction carried out under the authority of the Rain Creek Homeowners Association, directed by its president, Meredith Lawson. A murmur swept through the room. Eva began introducing the documents one by one: the contractor invoices, the falsified zoning maps, the correspondence between Meredith and Greenfront Solutions. She displayed enlarged copies of the emails, her voice rising just enough to cut through the rustle of the crowd. "Here," she said, pointing to one line highlighted in yellow, "Ms. Lawson writes, ensure that the Rain property is neutralized to prevent further agricultural spread." Neutralized. That is not a word of community care or maintenance. It is a word of eradication. Meredith's lead attorney objected, but the judge overruled him. Eva continued, her rhythm unrelenting, methodically weaving the story into a pattern of intent and profit. When she presented the bank statements, proof of payments from Greenfront Solutions directly to Meredith's personal account, the room went utterly still. The numbers glared from the screen, undeniable. Meredith's face drained of color. She tried to speak, but her attorney placed a hand on her arm, whispering urgently. It was too late. The illusion of control was gone. When the defense finally took the floor, their arguments were brittle, stripped of conviction. They claimed administrative confusion, clerical mistakes, unfortunate coincidences. Meredith sat rigid, her smile gone, her eyes darting toward the exits as if calculating escape routes. But when Eva called her to the stand, there was no way out. Under oath, Meredith maintained her composure at first, denying direct involvement, claiming ignorance of the chemical applications. Yet, as Eva pressed her, showing her own signatures on authorization forms and timestamps of transactions, the cracks deepened. "Are you telling this court," Eva said, her tone razor-sharp, "that your signature appeared on these documents without your knowledge, that the funds entered your personal account by accident, and that the destruction of my client's vineyard just happened to coincide with your pending sale of the same land to Westmark Properties?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Meredith hesitated, opened her mouth to answer, and then did something no one expected. She snapped. "You think this was just about him?" she said suddenly, her voice rising, eyes flashing with anger. "He stood in the way of progress. This entire valley could have been a thriving community, and instead it's a dying patch of dirt clinging to the past. He refused to adapt, refused to cooperate, and yes, I wanted it gone." Gasps erupted from the spectators. Her attorneys froze, and even the judge leaned forward, his expression grave. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Meredith seemed to realize too late what she had done. Her face crumpled and she sank back into her chair, her composure finally shattered. When the judge returned from recess, his verdict was brief but decisive. The court found the HOA and Meredith Lawson personally liable for willful property destruction, environmental contamination, and fraudulent misrepresentation. The HOA was ordered to pay full restitution, $800,000 in damages, along with legal penalties and the immediate resignation of its entire governing board. Furthermore, the judge referred the matter to the state prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges. As the gavel struck, a quiet ripple of relief and disbelief swept through the courtroom. Lucas exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. Eva placed a hand on his arm, smiling faintly. "It's over," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted over each other. Lucas said little. He wasn't interested in headlines or vindication, only in going home. As he drove back toward the valley, the afternoon light spilled across the hills in long, forgiving rays. When he reached the vineyard, the familiar silence greeted him, heavy but no longer suffocating. The vines, those that had survived, stood tall against the horizon, stubborn and enduring, just as they always had. He walked the rows slowly, the earth soft beneath his boots, the scent of soil and smoke still faint in the air. For a long time he stood at the edge of the field where the old oak tree rose, its branches sprawling wide like an open hand. He remembered his father's words, "Don't let them take it from us," and realized he hadn't. The vineyard was scarred, but alive. Justice, like the vines, took time to mature, but when it did, it was rich and undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Meredith resigned in disgrace. The HOA dissolved under state supervision, and the investigation widened to include other fraudulent land deals across the county. News outlets hailed Lucas as the man who had exposed one of the most corrupt local associations in California history. But to him, the victory wasn't about recognition, it was about restoration. Each morning, he returned to the fields, pruning the new shoots that emerged defiantly from the poisoned soil. They were small, fragile, but they were growing. And as he touched the young leaves glistening with dew, he whispered quietly, "We're still here." The valley felt different in the months that followed the trial, quieter yet somehow more alive, as though the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The air carried a hint of spring, and new leaves shimmered with a fragile, determined green. Lucas walked the rows every morning before dawn, feeling the soft resistance of the soil beneath his boots, listening to the wind that whispered through the vines. The earth had begun to heal, slowly reclaiming what had been poisoned, and with each new bud that broke through the ground, he felt something inside him mending as well. The vineyard no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a promise being kept. The state had appointed a temporary committee to oversee what remained of the HOA, but no one in the community wanted to revive it. The neighbors who once avoided Lucas now waved when they saw him, some stopping by to help replant or drop off tools, others simply to apologize. They confessed quietly that they had believed Meredith's lies, that fear had kept them silent. Lucas didn't hold grudges. He had seen what fear could make people do. Instead, he welcomed them with the same calm he used to greet the sunrise, grateful that they were finally seeing the valley for what it was. A home, not an asset. One afternoon, Iva visited the vineyard, walking slowly between the rows as if tracing the steps of a story she had helped rewrite. She handed Lucas a bottle with a simple label, Justice Reserve. It was from the small batch he'd managed to salvage after the poisoning, the last harvest his father's vines had produced before everything turned dark. They shared a glass under the old oak tree, the same one where his father used to rest, and for a while neither of them spoke. The wine was sharp and earthy, touched with bitterness, but beneath it lingered a quiet sweetness that stayed on the tongue long after the last sip. "It's imperfect," Lucas said finally, turning the glass in his hand. Eva smiled. "So is survival." As the sun began to dip behind the hills, Lucas looked out over the valley, the same land that had nearly been stolen, burned, and buried, yet still refused to die. The fences gleamed faintly in the fading light, the soil rich again with life. He thought about the people who had tried to destroy it, and how their power had withered faster than any vine under poison. What remained now was honest and raw, stripped of illusion. That night, before heading inside, he lingered by the gate. The stars were bright, their cold shimmer mirrored in the rows of young plants stretching toward the horizon. He could almost feel his father's presence there, patient and proud. The vineyard was smaller now, humbler, but it was alive, and it was his. He ran his hand along the wood of the gate, whispering to the night, "They thought they could bury us. They didn't know we were roots." The wind answered softly, rustling through the vines like applause.